Hi everyone, before I even finish the build series on my other car, this is an absolute pace Cobra. This particular kit I think is pretty cool, and it's something that I've been looking forward to building for a long time. So what I'll do is, you can see this is already rolling, but so I'm a bit behind with the videos, but I think you'll be interested to maybe, I guess, just cover why I chose this particular Cobra replica. Obviously Cobra replicas being one of the most I guess common types of kit cars that you're going to see people building themselves, but I think this one's sort of certainly at the best end of things in terms of what you can do. So before I get stuck into I guess looking at the installation of the suspension, the diff, and you know, the hubs and that sort of stuff, we might just talk a little bit about why I chose this particular one and why it's pretty special. And hopefully these videos, kind of like the ones on the Ultima, will be good for anyone who's thinking about building a car themselves, anyone who's thinking about purchasing one of these, and certainly help out anyone who's maybe in the process of building, and they can see how it all goes together. The idea eventually for this is that obviously I love building cars, but I can't keep obviously owning more and more. It starts to get a bit ridiculous. And what I'd like to do with this is probably just run along and really put some costs together accurately against the build, so that you can see how much it would actually cost you to build one yourself, and maybe give a good appreciation for, if you don't have the time, tooling or expertise to screw one together yourself, about what you would be looking to reasonably pay to have someone to do that for you. Me personally, I would like to continue building cars. So my idea with this is to get a real idea about what it's cost me to build it, get a real idea about the sort of time that's involved, and maybe just looking to the future about how I might want to screw a few of these together, and maybe even just build them and sell them, or even build on consignment. So it's going to be pretty interesting. I love it. I think it's a really cool car. It's going to be sort of a bit more of a traditional style of look to it, rather than you know, sort of modernising the Cobra. But I hope you guys like it. As always, you know, make any comments down below if you have any questions, and I'll help out if I can. Otherwise, hope you enjoy it. So I bought a Cobra. I needed something that was practical and cheap, which obviously isn't the Cobra, so I bought it anyway. Now, in my mind, the best cars are ones that aren't half-assed at trying to be two things at once. Four-wheel drives don't make great performance cars, and performance cars don't make the best four-wheel drives. So it's the same thing with a Cobra. You're either going for a traditional Cobra, or you're going to follow the sort of pro touring theme. I wouldn't consider them a resto mod, because there's not any restoration that goes on there. Obviously there's no original car that you're going to be building on there. The originals, of course, are maybe Australian. I think last one I saw was sold for sort of $2 million Australian. So they're a bit of a different kettle of fish. Both are great options. If you go around the traditional route, you're seeking to capture a period correct driving experience, in my mind. So in that case, originality is in fact king. You can't bitch about replicas not being in keeping with originality, but then fit modern tyres, brakes, engines, diffs, and run a chassis that's twice as good as the original, in my opinion. You know, I think if you're going to be recreating an early slab side Cobra, then it'd be stupid to go and do anything other than a transverse leaf arrangement for the suspension. The latter option of a pro touring type build is to try and inherit some of the style and some of the character of the original classic, but to make it perform, I guess, more in keeping with a modern performance car. It's that category that probably most replicas will fit into, outside of something like a super performance or a registered, you know, continuation type car. So here are my top 10 reasons why I chose the Cobra that I chose. Obviously, I'm going to try and stick to a bit of what I've sort of made in terms of notes, or otherwise we'll be up to 45 minutes of video and you'll probably have bowed out and not learned anything. But number one is body and styling. I think that there's some replicas that resemble Cobras. Lots of them look like they've just been melted in the sun. So the absolute pace option is exceptionally close, and was pulled from a genuine, the molds are actually sort of modeled off a genuine 427 SC. I can't remember who exactly owned the car. It could have been maybe Dick Smith or something like that, but those guys, you know, they went and actually got a real Cobra and made molds off it. So the body is also a carbon fiberglass composite. It's also available in full carbon or even aluminium for probably considerably more cost. I went for the fiberglass reinforced with carbon fiber, which is probably like great in terms of its performance and lightweight, but not blowing out the cost stratospherically. Factory 5 do good body shapes in fiberglass. Superformance do great shapes. You know, there are other manufacturers that do really well in that regard. Reason number 2 is donor parts. Any donor parts necessitate that you work around some existing dimensions, you know, weight, capabilities, etc. In a broad sense, the more donor parts you use, the more piecemeal a kit can become if you're not careful. A car is the sum of its parts, and it turns out that it can be a bit of a shit show if it's sort of all slapped together. Some of the Cobras that you see floating around are a bit crazy. The Absolute Pace chassis is basically a bunch of really good components, and lots of them are built specifically for this car so that they work well. Without quantifying, it's significantly more than lots of the other kits, or most other kits, if not all, that I've seen. Now, reason number 3 would be the quality of components, somewhat related to the donor parts. If you aren't going to develop your own stuff, because you know there is something that's existing on the market that's far better than you could ever hope to deliver yourself, you need to make sure that you're using top shelf stuff. So, you know, tilt and pedal boxes, Brembo brakes, that sort of stuff, which makes sense. Number 4, technology. Steel space frame chassis are probably the most common situation. Absolute Pace option uses a semi-monocoque aluminium chassis with inboard push rod mounted shocks and actuators. They're double wishbones, and you can fit any roll bars if you want. Obviously, it has a relatively low center of gravity to start with, so you kind of need to have a bit of a look at that relative to, say, the spring rates that you need in the car and that sort of thing. In terms of performance, this thing stands to probably show a clean pair of heels to quite a bit of the modern stuff. Number 5, ergonomics. Absolute Pace car doesn't have ridiculously offset pedal boxes. The dedicated chassis allows for tall drivers. It incorporates a lower floor and a rear bulkhead to get sort of guys up to, you know, 6'5" plus into it. In contrast to even say the Ultima, the car is pretty friendly. I would have no dramas with my missus driving this daily, and I don't think she'd have any problem with it at all, apart from maybe going deaf from the side pipes. Now, number 6, fake performance stuff. I hate fake performance stuff on cars. I could not accept fake center lock wheels or that type of thing, or fake side pipes. They look shit, and quite frankly, they're stupid. It's a bit like marrying an ugly chick and then, I guess, sticky taping a Mila Kunis mask to her face. It really doesn't make sense. Everyone knows she's actually ugly, and it's just a shit idea. So reason number 7, reliability and drivability. This car for me had to be built so it's turnkey. Implicit in that is general finish quality, and you have to have space for good cooling, AC, proper suspension travel, and you don't want it to be so harsh that you're avoiding hopping into the thing. You want to be able to just, you know, have this thing in the garage and hop into it like it was any late model HSV or Corvette type product, and just drive wherever you want. Number 8, driveline. There's some fun shaking things down, of course, and no doubt there will be some problems, but I want this car to be overbuilt in the driveline and easy to use. The gearbox is a TR6060, attached to a ZF LSD with a Chopin gear set. It shouldn't be it should just stand up to everything and really be no problem. I shouldn't be breaking things or you know, stripping drive lines or destroying clutches or anything like that. It should be more than adequate for this application. It means that if you wanted to hop in it and drive 5,000 k's to Perth tomorrow, you can. Number 9, obviously cost is something that is a reality that most of us have to deal with. I'll run over this in more detail, and I'll sort of develop as the videos move on, I guess. You can easily spend 200 to 300k on one of these things, or plus. Although the ballpark for my car and what I want to build this to and be able to just use it because of that, not worry about using it, is probably around about half that. So the basic kit, excluding gearbox, about $90,000 is what I paid for it. Obviously, there's a huge variety based on specifications, so you know, you'd really have to go and look through the extensive specification list yourself to make that decision. But I also ordered the gearbox through Absolute Pace with a short shift kit, etc., etc. So I think the bottom line there was about 6 figures, about $100,000 was the, you know, give or take a couple $100 was what I paid there. So reason number 10, engine options. Similarly related to cost, the Pace kit allows for everything from LS motors to old small block Fords. You can fit Coyotes, whatever you want to do. Why I do love later model stuff or LSs for, you know, dollars per horsepower, weight, reliability, and I'd happily fit one to maybe a car with different intents. I feel like small block Ford kind of keeps you out of car hell. I have a love for the sound and the character of them. They're pretty cheap relatively, and you know, a Ford motor in a Cobra works.
I've got a Holly Sniper that's ready to go instead of a carb because we just simply won't pass emissions in Australia without fuel injection. If I could do quad downdraft Webers, I would, but they're not drivable. They're basically objectively worse in every manner, except they're awesome, so I'll probably fit them down the road. So look, that's it. That's kind of summing up. That's my top 10 reasons for why I bought this particular Cobra and why I'm building it. Obviously different cars suit people for different reasons, but that's why I'm building mine. Now the video that follows on here is quite long. I actually had to split up. I just started taking a whole heap of footage and I didn't realize how much I'd amassed until I started to actually process it and edit it. This video is probably over an hour long already, so I'm gonna have to split it into at least one more or maybe two more, but you'll see at the end of the first one, I'm sort of got the shits about some suspension stuff and some driveline components. Like, you got to look at these cars, they're quite complex. There's lots of parts. There is going to be issues. And for me, it's more about the way that the people who bought the kit off react to those types of things. So, you know, I spoke to Absolute Pace about the stub axles that we had a bit of an issue with, and they got them out to me within the week, express post. So there was no bullshit there, and they really looked after me on that. So, you know, hats off to them. I haven't resolved some suspension issues, which I think was probably the one that frustrated me the most, but I'm still going to work through with that, and we're going to see where we get to it. You know, hopefully Absolute Pace are really good about it, and you know, one way or another we're going to solve it. So I think that you know, after sales service, particularly with something that's as complex as a car, is something to really focus on with these types of vehicles. You can see lots of people who do piss and moan as if they're expecting to walk into it like it's a standard dealership and that sort of arrangement. It's simply not. And you know, expecting someone who's a relatively small business to develop a car in its entirety is you know, a pretty big undertaking for them. Yes, you do pay a lot of money for these things, so your expectations should be you know, in keeping with that, but you know, fundamentally there are going to be a few issues, so let's just see how they go with that. Provided they keep looking after me and give me good customer service, I'm not going to complain about them. So look, thanks for watching. We'll get stuck into this, probably some more useful stuff. It is a long video, as I say, so skip forward, you know, do whatever you want to do to see the bits that you want to see. If there's any questions, standard deal. Thanks.
Okay, so here we've got the 3.45 ratio ZF limited slip diff. It has a shot pane gear set in it. This is pretty much the exact same diff that I had in my VF Maloo, so it stands up to quite a high horsepower even in standard form, and for the purposes of this build, for aforementioned reasons, is going to be more than adequate. One thing that probably I didn't anticipate that I was going to upgrade, but I think is actually pretty important retrospectively, is the diff bushings. Now these are standard brand new diff bushings, but I don't know whether you can make this out, but I can actually get a bit of distortion there quite easily just by hand. So after seeing that, that actually encouraged me to get some aftermarket bushes and install those. Obviously the payoff is going to be a bit of NVH, noise, vibration, harshness that you're going to get back through the vehicle, but it will hold this in place a lot better, and you know, prevent some of the issues that can arise with these types of cars, with you know, drive shafts popping out under load and all these other sorts of things. So the way that these diff bushes work is you press out the standard unit, which is basically like this. It's just a metal shroud, rubber inner with a central you know, metal sleeve here to stop crushing occurring. We punch that one out, and then we replace it with this two-piece item. You literally slide it in from both sides there, and then you put some lubricant in the inside there, and then put this crushed sleeve in the center to bolt it up. Now you want to make sure you do not lubricate between here and the housing. It is not designed so that these rotate in the housing. It is designed so that this bush rotates within this rubber, or you know, urethane mount. Now you'll see here, which I'm hoping we can make out there on the screen. Let me see if I can get the focus there. I don't know whether you can see that, but it is actually quite rough surface in there. It's sort of like a diamond etch type surface, and what that is designed to do is actually just retain the grease in here and provide lubrication throughout the life of this mount. It's something that people sort of aren't sure about, but it's actually this sleeve that rotates in the mount there to provide I guess the degree of articulation that you require. That's how that works. Now of course you can get these pressed out by workshop, but they're going to charge you a few bob to do it. So what you can do is buy a kit like I have, which is I'll put up on the screen there, which is basically just a bit of threaded rod. It's two basically two sort of shells here, one on either side. You have another nut with a bearing on the other side, and you just effectively screw the bush out. I'll show you how that's done in just 1 second here. One thing that I ran into with this particular diff, which is probably worth checking out, is we can see on this side here, we've got quite a low amount of clearance between the diff housing itself and the mount. So one of the problems is that you're not going to be able to push that out that direction. That's one issue. The other thing is that you're not going to get this sleeve in there to be able to do so. So what we're able to do is just turn up a much dodgier version in the lathe and just use that to actually pull the bush out in that direction. Not my finest. I would actually make this a lot thicker. I'd chamfer the edges and whatever if I did it again, but for the purpose of the exercise it did work. Now I'll show you with this one here how we're just going to wind this out now just quickly and how we put the new one in. Right, so you saw there that I had to sort of drive the tool back out with the punch, which was, you know, not a major drama and pretty easy to do. The other thing that I would make comment of is just when you're using that tool, just make sure that you perfectly align that the sort of tool so that when it pushes this bearing out, it doesn't get bound in the housing here. Now, pretty much apart from that, all you need to do is start assembling everything. So put on one of your fun gloves here. Obviously when you are doing this you will find that these two bushes at the front are actually different to the one at the rear, so it is worth noting. They're slightly greasy to start with, don't know why, but you just basically need to push these in like so. Should go in without a whole lot of drama. Now I say that this one won't go in. Oh, there we go. Other than that, it's just a matter of getting the lube, high performance lubricant, as it's called. This stuff here is from white line as it transpires, and you pretty much just get it in the hole here, so to speak. Have a bit of fun, do the Adele hello from the other side. I'm trying to do this without obscuring the camera or being too special with it. Try and get it everywhere as you can. Usually they give you like a couple of tubes of this stuff, and you like, I don't know, I find they don't tend to need all of it, but you know, a bit extra is probably not going to hurt anyone. If you put too much in, you'll find when you push the sleeve in, you'll just end up pushing most of it out, which, you know, isn't a major drama. You just got to clean it up. Let me just finish this before I push that sleeve in, and I'll show you the technique that I use for pushing the sleeve in. I mean, I'm not sure it's highly technical, but it seems to work alright for me. And obviously it does it with a minimum amount of fuss and bother. And it's with some tools that most people have. Now, as I said in the start of this video, what I'm going to do for this one is I'm actually going to keep tally of all of the costs that I'm going to have and all the tooling I'm going to have, so you can get a good idea of what it would cost you to upskill or uptool at the same time. The other thing that obviously is worthwhile considering with that is that if you can pay a shop to do it, but you can buy yourself all the tooling for similar money, then you know, give it a go, do it yourself. You get a sense of satisfaction out of doing it yourself, and you know, you learn a skill for the future and have tooling set up for otherwise. This is just a cheap hand clamp. You don't need the big ones. You should pretty much find that this goes in without a whole heap of drama. Done. One bushing done. Wipe the excess grease off. That's it. So there's a couple of washers there that I'm shooting for one. Again, this one here, like if you struggle for clearance, you might need a different clamp or something like that. You can often force these in. Bloody spider on me. You can push these in by hand. I like to pretend that you just whatever spider it was definitely not going to be the type one that would bite you and make you crook. Given how badly I tend to do any sort of, you know, pest control at my house, I don't want to put myself into a state of worry. Or my missus, who pretty much assumes that there's some way of keeping rid of these spiders. Final one. As you can see, this is all pretty pretty easy to do yourself, and you know, for a couple $100 versus paying a workshop which is going to charge a couple $100, for me it just seems like a bit of a no-brainer, you know. Give it a go yourself. You really can't, with stuff like this, stuff it up. And you know, for next time you're going to be able to do it for your mates, or do it on any of the other cars that you need to do it on. Particularly with these polyurethane bushes, or you know, poly bushes, you can do this stuff relatively easily, and it's a heap easier than pressing in you know, new rubber bushes with the steel sleeve and that sort of stuff. So highly recommended. Give it a wipe down. That's pretty much all there is to it. Try and get this excess grease out of the way. Don't worry about too much, like exactly the alignment of the sleeve in your bush, because that'll all get sorted when you actually tighten the bolt once it's in the car. Alright, so here's the differential sitting up here on my hoist. Look, it's able to be handled by one person if you're not a little bitch, but otherwise, you know, get some assistance, because it is a pretty heavy unit, I must admit. And this is a bracket that sits at the rear to basically bolt up here. So we can see in there with the diff mount, that one there basically sits like that. That mounting point there is going to go through here, and these two mounting points will actually bolt through the upright bit of the diff sort of mount there. You'll see this pretty quickly as it goes in, and it'll be quite self-explanatory, I imagine. I would suggest paying careful attention to the instructions just to make sure that you get the bolts in the right orientation, because there are some pretty tight tolerances and clearances to play with there. You might notice this nut on this particular bolt here is actually a half nut. We can see it there, as opposed to a full height nut, for that exact reason. So just be mindful of that. So this is a rear uppermost bracket in the chassis, and we've actually got to drill through into the chassis here and tap a 3/8 inch hole. It's not my favourite sort of detail, but what you do is you actually pack some shims in here, and then you can use a 3/8 inch bolt to thread into here. A couple of things. One, you have very limited space for a tap, so if you have a typical sort of apparatus like this that you use for tapping, it's a pain in the ass. You need a ratcheting one, or it's not the best because you can't put a whole lot of force on it, but you can generally get like a small ratchet with the right size. This is a 1/4 inch long socket on there that'll actually go over the end of the tap and drive its way in there. Obviously the other thing is that I'm usually pretty bad for this, but wear safety glasses when you start drilling above your head, so you don't have shit going into your eyes. I do have the spacers in here as well, so that just helps keep the drill bit aligned. And I'm not using a pilot drill, because what that does is it just means that there's no chance really that this drill can wander and misalign. It just means we get a good square tap, you know, perpendicular tap as we get into the chassis. Obviously it's a bit daunting drilling into the body of your pride and joy, but such is car building. You kind of just have to get amongst it and make it happen. Got a depth gauge here as well that I measured off the length of the tap. The only comment I'd make there as well is that it needs to be a little bit longer than the length of the bolt, because you've got a taper on the end of any tap. There's actually a taper just at the top section here that helps I guess align the tap as it goes into the hole. So we need to make sure that we're not counting that section, because otherwise what will happen is that your bolt, which isn't tapered, will bottom out before it's all the way home. So just something to be aware of. Oh, gives you a good shoulder workout. So yeah, just drill 4 of those, easy. This isn't as a final fit up yet. I'll put some Loctite or whatever on these bolts, but I'm just using it to align the spacer so that the spacer itself doesn't, like, sort of provides a good guide and doesn't move around once I'm drilling the other hole after the initial one's lined up. Fixing this D bracket in the rear in place. As we said, we've drilled the holes, we've tapped them, that's all good. Made sure the thread's all clean, blown it out with the air compressor. What you want to do is obviously you're threading a steel fixture into aluminium, so you need to have some sort of you know, lubricant or something like that to thread into the chassis here. What I'm going to use is just a bit of thread locker, blue thread locker. It does provide sort of a if you like, a bit of a break between the two different materials that are mating, so there should be no you know, galvanic interaction there or whatever like that causes the fixture to seize in place. But the other option that they've quoted in the manual is to use so anti-seize or something like that, which I'm not particularly a fan of in this instance, because obviously there's nothing else apart from the bolt tension itself that's holding the fixing in place. I'd much rather use you know, the thread locker just to know that it's going to make sure that these don't unwind themselves due to vibration or something like that. Obviously the other thing is that because we're fixing into aluminium, we can't provide, and I wouldn't recommend providing the noted 60 newtons of torque on these bolts. Obviously the 3 bolts here that have got a nut on the other side definitely do so. 60 newtons I feel like someone's pulled up somewhere, but that's, you're leaning pretty heavily on the breaker bar on you know, say a 350 mil torque wrench like this to get it to do what it needs to do there. But certainly for these ones, you're probably talking about less than half that. I like to do it just by feel. One thing I can recommend if you are new to doing mechanic work is actually just to get a whole bunch of sort of different rated fixings, you know, bolts, and either tap a hole into some plate or even just, you know, put a hole into some plate and weld a nut on the other side and use whatever breaker bar that you've got and actually snap each of those fixings off, so you can get a feel for actually how hard you can lean on them before they do snap off. It'll save you a shitload of time trying to use easy outs or, you know, reverse thread drills to extract fixings once you've snapped them off, particularly into cast type things like engine blocks and stuff will be a real pain in the ass for you in the future. So if you are new to it, that's something I definitely recommend doing. I think everyone, I don't know whether they still make them do it at TAFE, but I think mechanics used to be made to do that at TAFE so they could get a bit of a feel for things. Anyway, look, I'm just going to do these up. I can use a torque wrench on, just to give you an idea of what I reckon is about the right level of fixing for it, but I reckon, yeah, it'll be about that 20-25 newton, something like that. Or, you know, if you're not using an extra long breaker bar, it's probably just, you know, as far as you could reasonably, you know, without being sweating too hard, as far as you could reasonably do these up in place. Obviously, if you get all the fixings in, you can sort of do them up in stages, so, you know, all of these 4, so you actually make sure everything's seated in at home in the right way. It's the same as if you're putting a wheel on a car, right? Like you do it up in a star pattern to make sure that the mating surfaces have come up together neatly and that you don't have any misalignment that would mean that you've sort of done a bolt up incorrectly that's going to come loose. So I'm sort of thinking, yeah, probably about as tight as I want to do up into aluminium. The way that this bracket is actually loaded as well is like, this is really more about just keeping this located against the bottom of the chassis mount there. That's the block that has the pivot point for the cantilever suspension above it. So in terms of the way this is loaded, most of the force sort of laterally or shear force is going to be taken by these 2 bolts here, and these ones here is just to prevent any flexing and kind of engage the chassis here to the top of the bracket there. So just kind of tie it all in. I don't think these should really need to be done all that tight. Anyway, let's see how good my guess was at 20 to 25 newtons. We'll take this at, that's 22 newtons. So we'll see. Of course, this is like the most awkward fucking position in the world. Where you usually slip off and skin yourself. I reckon it's got to be there or thereabouts. Just see. So I probably had them done up around about, 20 newtons to start with. That's sort of 25 there. So yeah, there or thereabouts, I reckon, is about as tight as you'd want to do them up in aluminium. The other ones are 60, so I think they're well and truly not going to come apart. Obviously, as always, I'm just going to mark these to make sure that I can see if they did unwind themselves at all. Unsurprisingly, where these push rods feed through the boot floor, you have to seal around them with a sort of basically a CV boot and a flange. It's a pretty low-tech solution. It's just a plastic ring. I'm pretty sure these are a plumbing fixture, but we can see that they're white. No one's ever going to see them unless you're under the car. But just as is my sort of thing, I'm just going to paint these in black. I have had some success with VHC. It's high temp plastic paint. It's kind of designed to paint things like engine covers, that sort of stuff. I've used it on a couple of distributor caps just to paint them in black. But yeah, look, if you want a sort of relatively low tech, low cost solution, I think this is about $30 a can. The other option, of course, would be for me to, machine something up out of aluminium or go a bit crazy like that. I mean, for something that no one's ever going to see and functionally is kind of at the arse end of the earth, I think just giving these a bit of a hit of the black paint is probably nice as a token gesture, and will get us out of trouble. Obviously, we cut these down so that they fit over, and we'll get that done. Just assembling these rear uprights. What I found was there wasn't clearance between the housing itself and the 18mm bolt that was provided. Sometimes they provide cap head screws for these. In this case, they didn't, and there isn't clearance. So thankfully, I was able to duck down to the local hardware, buy the cheapest 18mm socket I could find, and then also just machine it down in the lathe. Obviously, you need to be somewhat conscious of the fact that we're going to reduce the wall thickness here, so we'll see if this lets go. But I guess you can add the cost of an 18mm socket, and also I guess the lathe, because it's not going to be the first time we're going to use on this job for certain, to the cost of the tooling. But it's just things like these that can be a real pain in the ass. I mean, if you didn't have access to a lathe and you didn't have the ability to do what I've just done there, you're running into a situation where I guess you are either going down to the hardware to try and find an equivalent cap head screw, or you're going to need to contact the manufacturer and then wait for that sort of shit show, which is going to be a real pain in the ass. So look, it's just one of those things, but something to always be aware of, and something that I've sort of found over time can delay your build a bit and be a bit of a nightmare. So this should get us out of trouble, thankfully. Part of this involves fitting these, what do we call them, top hat bushes into the rod ends. Alternatively, you can have urethane bush. I tend to like urethane bushes or rubber bushes for the NVH, and also just the shock loading, a bit of insulation from that. So if you do drive through a massive pothole, it's not just, there's no give in the whole suspension setup. It seems most of these are actually pushing in by hand. The instructions say that you might have to press these in with a vise or a press, but I think if the fitment is correct, you usually don't have to force these in too hard. If I have any that are a bit difficult, I still like to use just these grip clamps. They're kind of like a softer way of doing it, and you can get just a good alignment of it with no sort of major drama, and just see they just sort of pull in without too much of a trouble. I find that the more you force things, usually means that you're forcing it and it's on the piss, or you're forcing it in the wrong direction. These aren't like the type of thing where they're a proper press fit type item, because obviously there's no need for them to bind there, and there's not going to be any free play anyway. So just something to be conscious of if you are building one of these. It hasn't been a drama for me. What I haven't done is shown you a whole heap of videos of me putting all of these sort of bolts and arms together. It's a fairly monotonous task. I've just been doing it over a few whiskies over a few nights. Whenever it's sort of I've got a few hours spare, or even half an hour spare, just slowly working away at it and picking things off my list. Seems to work pretty well. Obviously, once I get it, my plan is pretty much to put all of this stuff together as best I can, and then I go through and tension everything and mark everything with a paint pen or a marker, just to, I guess, sign off on it and say that it's been tensioned and hit with a torque wrench. Lots of these things I think that you probably do without a torque wrench. They're not critical like, say a head stud or something like that, but they are, for want of a better term, still important to make sure that they're done up tight, and to have a methodical process just working through these. There was one bolt that I had missing from the control arms here, but I just it's kind of one of those things. There was another bolt that was a bit longer, but I just couldn't deal with it because of my OCD, so I went to the bolt shop and of course pay $6 to get myself just one bolt. But I always think it's worth it, and it's just, I don't know, it'll always play on my mind if I don't do it properly. Other than that, the one tool that I can recommend is, this is a Milwaukee, just a 3/8 inch electric ratchet. It just saves you so much time when you're going through and doing this monotonous stuff, just to get everything torqued up to spec as you know, or not torqued up to spec, but just, you know, run the bolts up, the nuts right up to the bolts so it's all a snug fit, and then you just go through with the torque wrench and just tighten it all up. You know, this has taken me a few hours literally just to get all of this sort of stuff done, and this would have saved a fair bit of time at that. So, you know, hats off to the people who are doing it manually, that's for certain. As part of this assembly process, and pretty much whenever you're putting dissimilar metals together, you need to hit most of these things with some anti-seize or copper grease. There's no particular brand that, you know, I prefer or anything like that. Pretty much just buy whatever's on special. The way that I've found most effective to do that is just to put a little bit on the thread, and this has a locking nut in this case. You can try and smooth that out a bit if you want with your finger, but just, if I run the locking nut along there, you just want to make sure that all mating surfaces have some of that anti-seize on it. It's not the type of thing where you need to go crazy. You see lots of these guys are saying, okay, yeah, you need to coat the shit out of everything. All it does is just makes a mess and is a pain in the ass later, because you've got to clean it off. Inevitably it gets dirt in it, etc, etc. And I don't know whether you can see on the camera there, hopefully you can, but the thread itself has just got a fine film all over it with that copper anti-seize. I'll just thread this on quickly, and once it's in there, we're just going to feed this into the, if I can get this off with grease off me, into the wishbone here. What I've done as well with all of this sort of stuff is label each of the components just in a very inconspicuous place. Jesus, this thing's a virgin, it won't go in. Never had that problem. So yep, just screw that in there. We can see that that's actually, you can tell pretty quickly whether you got the right amount of anti-seize on it as to whether the thing's moving freely. We can see here that this is actually going in really easily. I like to bottom out the thread as well. So what I'll do is I'll bottom this out, and then even if I adjust it out later, it just makes sure that the thread is coated right down to the bottom. You know, for the future if you decide that you need to readjust it in. Done. Alright, so we're just going to quickly run through the assembly of one of the bell cranks. This is of course the pivot point between your push rod that is connected to your lower control arm and the coilover itself. One of the biggest advantages of having inboard mounted shocks set up like this is it reduces unsprung weight, and there also are some secondary benefits. Like you would have seen in F1, they do it for aerodynamic reasons and that sort of stuff. From my point of view, I really think it's a good thing in terms of unsprung weight. They reckon pretty much, as a rule of thumb, you're saving, you know, if you save 3 kilos on the car, it's the same as saving 1 kilo in terms of unsprung weight, in terms of performance. So it's definitely hugely beneficial. You will have some other advantages like, you know, better steering feel and a whole heap of other things like that, but it also looks really cool, which is quite nice. So what we're doing here is we've got the bell cranks, which are labelled left hand, right hand. You've got a bearing that you need to insert into each side. It doesn't actually matter which way these go around. What I always try to do is, if possible, just try and fit them in by hand. They are a press fit. If you get them aligned, they go straight in. Of course, the other option is, and I absolutely love this tool and always recommend it, is just use a set of quick grip clamps. These are just a soft jaw thing, and it gives you a really good feel for pushing these things in. So if you have any misalignment, you can sort of feel it as it starts to pull the tension up. It just saves you ruining any of the bearing surfaces, and good way to do it. So let's see if this one goes in as well, just by pushing it, if I can get it aligned. You can see that it's sort of a bit misaligned, but finally goes in home and then falls out predictably. There we go, back in there now. We've got these separating sort of little bushes that we need to install. What you want to do with these, of course, is get a little bit of Loctite on all of them. I pretty much find the way that I've found this to be quite useful is just by threading them in by hand. This is probably somewhat really boring. There's just like a heap of time monotony just talking everything, assembling all of these, so I can completely understand that this is a bit boring as far as video is concerned, but for people who are building these cars it might be particularly useful. So I like to just get these in position and sort of assemble it all by hand.
and then just do some final torquing. Now Loctite's the type of thing that you obviously want to get assembled sooner rather than later, because it is something that dries out. So, you know, once you start this process, try and get it done, and try not to get interrupted by the in-laws popping around or whatever it is otherwise that you need to do. So I'll try and probably just speed the video up here, and you'll see me assemble this, and then we'll torque it all up. There's a spacer that goes in here that you'll see pretty shortly. This is the process for installing the control arms and the front uprights. It's pretty much the same in the rear, to be honest with you, apart from the drive shaft installation, obviously, which I'll show you. But what I'll do with this is I'll just sort of talk you through as I'm going through. I might speed up the video or slow it down depending on how much shit I'm talking or whether there's anything of value. So we'll get into it. Obviously, I've just laid everything out so it's ready to go. You know, have your bolts ready, have your sockets, whatever it is that are going to be the right size to do it. I like to just get everything in place and assembled, and then tighten it off at the end and mark everything. It's just sort of like whatever you're doing, you need to have some sort of process to make sure that you don't miss anything, and you've got a good spanner check on all of the fixing points so that there's no dramas in the future. Right, we'll get into it. When I've laid out these control arms as well, I've just like laid them out on the, well, in this case the car hoist, so that they're, what do you say, positioned so it's as they'll get installed into the car, so I don't have to think about it, you know, whether this is this way up with the long section to the front or the long section to the rear. I just sort of get all of that and examine the diagram so that I'm, like, before I touch anything and put any bolt in, I sort of already have a bit of a plan of attack. Obviously with this, the reason it's good to have all the bolts and stuff in position is you can do this and it saves you dropping everything on yourself. With some of these fixing points where they're particularly tight, say on the front here, you tend to have to just sort of install the nut before you put the bolt all the way home, because otherwise it comes up against the front section here and you won't be able to get a spanner onto it. Also, when you're tightening it up, don't put the ring spanner on here when you're doing it up, because you'll find that your ring spanner actually won't be able to get back out once you've got it tightened. Ask me how I know that. Just do this. It doesn't particularly matter whether you do the top or the bottom one first. Sort of is what it is. Whatever you feel comfortable with. I like to just put something down so that your control arm can sort of rest on it as well, so it doesn't get scratched. Obviously, there's a, you know, nice CNC cut aluminium item, so we don't want to bugger them up at all. It does actually say, I think, in the instructions to test fit all these, but I haven't, touch wood, had a drama so far. Unless I spoke too soon. I've just got one of these top hats that's just sitting out proud a little bit, so I just need to tap it into the rod end. If I can. Right, there we go. Back to work. I'm not sure whether it matters or not, but it is sort of, I mean, it looks neatest, but I think in the instructions it did mention that you were to have all bolts facing outwards with the nuts on the outside. As I say, I don't know whether that makes any difference, to be honest with you. I would suggest not, but if in doubt, just follow the instructions. The thing which is quite good about this as well, and that they've thought about it, is that on these bolts they're actually sometimes a lot longer than they need to be, just to ensure that the section that sits in the mounting point here is actually the full shank of the bolt. Because when you cut a thread onto a bolt, what you're actually doing is you're taking material out of that diameter. So, and anytime you have any cut or any sharp change in direction, it's obviously a stress propagation point. So, in that regard, it sort of makes sense to make sure that the bolts are sort of taking the load on the shank. Usually whenever you drop a nut, it tends to bounce 300 meters across the garage floor. It actually didn't in that case. Who would have thought? Alright, these are all in position now. You can obviously just nip them up, which is sometimes nice to do when you've got the best access at the moment. So, you know, in that regard, I can probably just sort of do that quickly. Again, I'm going to get my trusty, noisy Milwaukee electric ratchet here. This is actually like so good and saves so much time. I know it's a bit... Done. You've got headphones on, I'm sorry if I blew your head off, but it is what it is. If I was better with video, I probably could have changed the audio level, but that definitely didn't happen. It's kind of nice at this stage as well, just to nip these up and check that everything still moves as it should. You know, just do it by hand, make sure that's all doing what it's meant to do. We'll adjust these and get them all nipped up correctly and that sort of thing a bit later. Let me just say that's quite loose there, for example. But we'll use that to, I like to just have all these rod ends, what do you say, aligned properly as well. So that's how we'll nip that one out. We'll do the same here, so that's probably just tight. Yeah. Anyway, that's that stuff in place. Obviously that's not going to mount like that, so we need to... I think there were some recommendations as well in the instructions just about how much thread was sort of showing top and bottom for these. Obviously adjusting these would change your camber settings. So one to sort of be aware of. Yeah, same deal with this upright that will get installed. Make sure the camera's still on properly. Again, you've got washers of specific thicknesses that do specific jobs, so you need to think about that. What else are we gonna do? Just want to go grab one more bolt or a screwdriver or something, so that when I've got a screwdriver here, I'll do it. So if I don't have the bolt, when I put this upright in position, I can just drop that through and it'll stop it from falling away. Trick for young players as well with this one. You'll see on the upright here, I thought the bolt was far too long. There's actually a recess just here where my finger is. It's that. There's actually a little recess there that allows the bolt to go through there. You'll see what I mean in 1 second. There's not a heap of weight in this, but it's a little bit awkward. No washer there. So we're just going to get that positioned. Second set of hands, you probably wouldn't go too astray. Steering arm gets in the way like a bastard. What we wanted, but we do need to do this as well. Right. Because here your arm, like mine, will probably start to get tired. That's why we had this guy here to drop it through. this steering in particular, you won't worry about tightening off for a bit. I just want to sort of get it in the general position there. And then we'll fine tune that once we obviously get the alignment in. Now, it's a 24mm spanner I've got there. I'm feeling what it is, I sat this on something on the other side, which I'll probably do again. Of course, I took away all my little bits of wood. Pain in the ass. This is a bit dodgy, but we're going to do it anyway. Whatever. Fucking idiot. Alright, so here we have got the rear coilover that we're going to just add some preload to before we put it into the car. Putting some additional preload on the car, on the coilover will obviously change your ride height, but it won't change your spring rate. That's actually a big misconception, and it's even noted in the instructions here incorrectly, that compressing your spring will change the spring rate. That is not the case. The spring rate is a characteristic of the spring itself, and you cannot change the physical property in that regard. These are made by a company called Alden American. I've never heard of them. The one thing I do like about this though, even though it's not an adjustable shock length, is we seem to have quite a bit of travel here, which means that I'm hoping that we're going to get quite a bit of opportunity to get some like actual decent wheel travel, which is important to be able to tune your suspension, especially for a fast road car, to be able to absorb, you know, pretty decent bumps and not have a spring rate that's ridiculous, which usually results in a fairly snappy sort of handling characteristics. So I think that's quite good. I am going to wind the preload on in here out of the car before I put it in. It's really good that the information that's contained in this kit actually gives you a good idea of a starting point for that. If we look in the rear of the car here at the installed setup just above the diff there, we can see once that other shock gets in there, it's going to be really quite a pain in the ass to get the C spanner in there to actually adjust these shocks. So in terms of future serviceability, I'm hoping that we're not going to run into too many major drums there, especially once the boot floor and everything's in. Obviously that's I'm standing in the boot effectively at the moment. It's something we're going to need to be conscious of, and maybe even particularly before we start sealing all of this stuff up, we might actually do a suspension alignment on the car before we put all that stuff in, rather than, you know, wait until the end and then, you know, string box it and go from there. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but in terms of your build process, it would be certainly, I think, wise to get that all to happen sooner rather than later. The other problem that I've run into here, which is, let me just get some light on the subject, that might help. As we can see here is the mounting bracket here that's installed. Your bell crank runs here like you would on the front. We have the shock on one side and then the push rod that goes down to your lower control arm on the other. But we can see this hole here doesn't align with this bracket and is not going to align with that bracket. So that's a bit of an issue, and the only way that we can get around that, the one on the other side does. But the only way we're going to get around that is actually you either would have to clearance the weld a little bit, clearance the aluminium, or sort of cut this bracket down a little bit. In this case, I'm just going to apply, obviously there's no way for me to calculate this because it's not like I know what the forces are that are involved here to be able to, you know, even get a good idea of where the failure points and how stressed these components are, to say whether you would like to, you know, trim down the aluminium or trim down the steel itself. But given that we've got anything you'd want to modify like this, you always got to think about the failure mode. You know, if this pivot joint was to break away, it would be unlikely that it's going to break away in a massive stratospheric fashion. And if it did, you would rather that it would actually have the bracket crack here and fail out, on the premise that the other bracket, being steel, is more likely to bend rather than completely blow out. Whereas trimming out of the aluminium, we definitely don't want the aluminium to fail, and you certainly wouldn't want this whole block that's welded into the chassis here to blow out at all. So I think it's kind of smartest in that regard to probably just trim the steel bracket itself. What we'll do is, because it's going to be visible and it is kind of an aesthetic part of the car, we're just going to basically get probably a socket or something like that, and just sort of sketch around here with a pen just to take just a little bit off progressively, and even just taper the backside there to sort of clearance away from the weld, just so that bracket can sit flush. No one will ever know the difference but me, and there'll be no issue in terms of, you know, taking a little bit of material out of this bracket. The other one's still going to have the full amount of material and not be a drama, and it's still in, you know, bolted in 2 points at double shear, so I don't think there'd be any dramas with that in that regard. So yeah, we'll just trace that around with a Sharpie there and just take it off on the linisher, and then get this installed so we can finish the rear suspension. The only other thing which is a bit unfortunate that's going to stop me from getting this thing rolling immediately is if we look over here, oh fuck, I just hit my head, is here is the rear upright. That's the stub axle with the drive shaft on it. And they don't fit, so I either have the wrong wheel bearing or the wrong stub axle. And the other thing that's a bit of a pain with this is it says in the instruction manual that you can't load this wheel bearing until you have the stub axle bolted through. It must just help the bearings be retained in there, so that's going to be a real pain in the ass if I want to get this thing rolling like I do right now, so I can get it down to my other garage and get it in my other workshop, so I've got a lot more space to work on it. I'm going to have to work out about, you know, probably just get a bit of threaded rod and a big washer maybe either side, just so I can mount the wheel up, have it all in place, and then at least transport it with the wheels on as I planned on my car trailer, so I can roll it on and off, and then deal with this once everyone's back at work after New Year's.
Okay, we're in the back here. We're in the back here, and I just wanted to talk about this rear suspension installation. This has actually gone a little bit more smoothly than the front, but there is a couple of things that I think are just maybe minor oversights just in regard to this setup. Now this is pinned through here, so you've effectively got your mounting point sitting here, and obviously this bell crank is operating in almost a perpendicular plane, and as such, because this sweeps through an arc, you're going to have some misalignment of the shock as it moves through that arc. Now what that's going to mean is that this mount's going to have to pivot, and you've got some lateral load on the shock, and anytime you do that, you kind of have two effects. One, it's going to start to effectively chew out the bush a little bit, but also it puts some lateral load on this shock, and you can have binding and wearing in the shock itself. Worst case, if that misalignment's too great, you can actually break a shock. I don't think it'll be obviously bad enough for that to occur in this case, but it is just something that I think is probably a bit of an oversight just in the way that this is all arranged. I mean, obviously packaging wise, you need to make this work with the rest of the diff and stuff like that, but if you could have the mount in the same plane as this, and just enough clearance for both these shocks to pivot in this direction as it sweeps through this arc, that would just be a slightly better outcome. The other thing I've had to do is this mount, which I spoke about before, that obviously is a too tight a tolerance to the body itself. I've had to just sort of notch a washer to make that work, to get clearance for that, and I've also had to just notch the head of the bolt there so that I can get enough clearance to feed the bolt in there. Bit of a pain. You'll see when I start to install this that I actually have to bend the shock slightly to get it to line up and get the bolt through there. The other thing, which is less than ideal having done this one, is the operation I've been using for this. Obviously it's not like you can get a spring compressor in here, right? And because of this arc, we can see that we need this to come down quite a bit more for this shock to be compressed as well, so that we can get this bolt hole to align with this. Now to compress this shock, obviously we can't compress it down against the spring unless you have a spring compressor, and you're also pushing down hard against the damper itself. But one way that I've sort of come up with this in a bit of a bootleg fashion, hence these zip ties, is, thank you for every dodgy Indonesian video I've seen on the internet, is I've just wound this spring perch up. That's sort of its factory 40mm compression setting. And I'll put these zip ties in to retain the spring in its compressed state. I'll then wind this down so that the spring will free float. That gives me enough, just enough bloody clearance for me to be able to push this damper down and compress it so I can get these bolt holes to line up and get it all together. The other thing, which is
a drawback for that is that to be able to wind this spring perch back up to get enough preload on the spring to get the ride height correct, it's virtually impossible. There's no way I'm getting a ring spanner in there. So I don't know what everyone else has been doing to get that to actually get to its factory preload, unless they're, I don't know, doing something odd like cutting down a C-spanner to, you know, a thin sliver that's going to fit between this hole, or some such sort of thing. Maybe even just ramping down the end so you can get just enough clearance. You have to have a bit of a play with it. Obviously with the diff in there on the other side, there's no clearance on the other side too to be able to get in there and actually you know, tension your spring perch up. So I just did that literally as far as I could by hand easily. I might try and with the suspension load get another 10 or 15 mil, but you know, we're trying to get to 40 and we're probably at about, be lucky to be at 25 or 30 there at the moment. So that'll be something interesting to play with down the track. Probably won't matter for the moment because the car's unloaded. You know, we don't have an engine, gearbox and stuff in there. This level of preload will probably have it at almost an effective ride height. But anyway, I'll just do a quick video here of me tensioning this up, and you can probably laugh at me struggling and sweating and swearing to try and get this stuff all in place. Alright, so we're going to be installing the beautifully Cerakoted front shock mounting bracket in here. I should probably get one of the bolts prepared so it doesn't fall out. I haven't test fitted this, so we'll see how we go. Definitely a bit tight there on that side. The good thing about Cerakote is it doesn't generally add a lot of thickness to things, which is quite good. So in terms of fitment, it's not too bad. Looks like about right now. This will be where the lower points of each shock fits to it. Get these in place. Torque them up. And then we can get those front shocks in with the control arms. Obviously I didn't plan on Cerakoting everything in this engine bay, but I've sort of gone with a bit of a, like I feel like, what's the rule of thumb? You kind of stick with 3 colours and that's it. And in this sense you've got the bare aluminium, sort of the gold of these zinc plated fixings, and then I thought black worked sort of pretty well outside of the green body, just to try and keep it as simple as possible, but you know, relatively neat. But I think it's all going to work out pretty well. Touch wood. And yeah, I just ceramic coated this. Part of that was actually just learning how to ceramic coat, so I'll give you a bit of a rundown on how I went about that, and I actually did the side pipes and stuff with that as well, which has turned out pretty well for a first try. I'll be better at it the second time, no doubt, and going forward, but I think you can agree it looks pretty neat.
We're installing the bell cranks into the chassis now for the pushrod suspension. This will sit inside the mounting bracket here. What you need to look at here is just make sure you've got the right washers in the right location, and that you're using the right bolts in the right spot. What you will do is you'll find that within your kit there's usually some special washers that are labelled accordingly, you know, or packed and stacked to identify them as being of a particular use, and we just need to get these in place here to ensure that everything aligns properly and there's no float in the suspension linkage setup. Because obviously if you had any float, what would happen is that eventually you'd have sort of continual continual vibration at the joint, which would obviously wear the joint out and reduce the effectiveness of your suspension. So we just want to leave all this loose at this stage. As I say, because it is sort of built to reasonably good tolerances, you are going to need to sort of just assemble it in stages. We can see here the bell crank itself. We've got some thicker washers that are going to sit on the outside, and we've got some thinner washers that we're going to use as spacers there. And then we've also got a machined step bolt that we're going to need to install there. So you can see here we've got those two washers to use as spacers there. And if I can take this nut off, we've got the machined bolt. We're just going to need to get in here and hopefully not drop it all and get it together there. As I say, leaving this all loose is the way to go, and then once you've got it all together, you'll tighten down the brackets first, and then tighten down this bell crank bolt. There's a step shaft there, so sometimes it doesn't want to go in. Just making sure we've got the washers in the right place. Right, so we've run into a little bit of drama at the front here trying to get the suspension installed. There's two major issues. One, these shocks, from my mind, are just not suited for this type of application. What should be happening with this is that this shock should have an internal bump that at full droop, the internal bump actually takes the load. But because of this alignment, I can't actually get the shock holes to line up here without the shock itself fouling on these bell cranks. So what would happen is that in full droop, the thing that's going to take it is actually the surface between this shock top and also this bell crank. It's not really good because they're both aluminium, so it's just going to chew out over time. I know there's a lot of people who probably will never have the thing at full droop, but if you're really going to use your car, you're going to race it, going over ripple strips, even driving into potholes, it's going to hammer that out before too long. So that's actually inadequate. The only other way to deal with that, if we're going to retain these shocks, is to actually just try and fabricate something so that this bell crank or something like that catches onto a bump stop, an external bump stop somewhere before it has this shock hitting the housing. That actually pisses me off a little bit, because I think this shock, given the sort of investment that you make in these cars, should be a custom fitment for this vehicle. It's just a matter of literally this shaft needs to be a couple of inches too short. It also makes it a real headache trying to get this installed. There's no access there to get the C-spanners in to actually wind the shock up and down. I've just wound the shock up as much as I can and then used a couple of zip ties to try and reduce this spring length so that I can actually compress the shock enough to get the alignment right to feed this through. Then the next problem is, it's not an issue on the bell cranks on the rear because I've measured them, but when I check these with my micrometer, you're talking about 12.64 mil for this bolt. It's meant to be a precision ground bolt, and then the holes here are only coming in at 12.45. So I've even tried to just lubricate to sort of press fit these through, and it's not wanting to go home, and it started to just create a bit of a burr here on the bell crank.
Not ideal. I mean, this is obviously a CNC cut piece of material. I don't understand how that can be the incorrect size. Pretty frustrating because of these shocks. I'm having to work pretty hard to compress this shock. I've got to try and get a shim either side and put this precision bolt through whilst I've got this under compression using my own weight. It's a real pain in the ass. I can't reduce the size of this box, then you can have float in there. So I'm going to have to just clearance these bell cranks at all of these front ones to get that to happen, which is just super frustrating, and it makes it really difficult to install. If this was the right length, I should just be able to bend these bell cranks over, bolt it in and move on with putting in the push rods. But instead this turns into a major exercise. And it's actually really difficult to get it installed. Like trying to compress this damper, I mean, that's all my weight there to try and get that compressed, and then I've got to try and align this with the shims in place, get the right alignment and put this bolt in. And yeah, like to find out that this is actually not the right size after going through all that is pretty painful. But such is working with cars, sometimes it really fights you and you just got to, I guess, push on. I'm just going to try and ream this out slightly so that I can get this bolt to go through. And I guess we keep on moving.